Just Picture It is a show and an experiment, and I'm so glad you're able to join us. Drawing pictures is something humans have done for thousands of years. Yes, they can be beautiful. Today we're going to explore questions that go beyond the beauty of pictures. Why do we draw pictures? Can pictures make it easier to talk together, to understand each other? And if we want to imagine a better future, can pictures help us imagine together? A picture tells 1,000 words, so can we use pictures to get beyond the words, to share those concepts and dreams so we can bring them to reality? In this show, we'll be talking about how companies and organizations in and around the Silicon Valley and now beyond are beginning to use the language of pictures to help innovate, to bring forward those things that are new, to bring people to work together in new ways. Yosemite Valley is one of the natural wonders of the world, a precious resource for California and the United States. David Sibbet pioneered using pictures interactively in planning by both businesses and communities. Yosemite National Park used this picture approach to help plan its priorities in conjunction with the public. David, tell us how they started to do this.
It's a very interesting story. It really began a couple of years ago when Don Neubacher became the new superintendent of Yosemite. And he had actually gotten acquainted with this way of working back in the Presidio of San Francisco. I think if you remember, the 6th Army had this beautiful 1,400-acre Presidio, which has been a garrison for over 200 years in this spot. And it was decommissioned and turned over to the National Park Service. And at that time, they began a very intricate planning process, which involved lots of community meetings. This is one that was being held in the old officers' quarters. And in these meetings, they really wanted to find out from the community what the best uses would be for this unbelievable resource.
Now, this was not a simple process, I understand. I mean, there was controversy. People said, don't do this, don't touch that. It's San Francisco. We protest about everything. So how did pictures help?
Well, we knew we had to orient. We were asked at the Grove Consultants International, my company, to facilitate a series of 6 visioning meetings throughout the region. And in order to orient people to what they were doing in these meetings, we really needed to get them quickly into the right frame of mind, into a spirit of contributing. And we thought that big murals would be the best way to do this. So we initially, when they walked into these meetings, if you can imagine this long mural being up on the wall and you're a public person, this is a picture actually of the entire planning process in some detail. At this scale, what you can see are the yellow circles, which represented all of the different public input meetings. Now, the problem we were solving with this big picture was the problem of somebody over here on the left coming to one of these visioning sessions. And here, let me zoom in on this with a little tool here.
David, what was the time frame for all of this?
This was happening in the early 90s. In San Francisco. I think it was decommissioned in '88. And the park itself, if you notice on this over here, the park had a planning process represented by these wavy blue arrows, which follows a very rigorous process of getting public input, looking at different alternatives, and then they were going to upgrade the general management plan of the Presidio. At the same time, they were taking over some of the Presidio. The Army, this brown bar down here, was going through a closure process, and the city itself was coordinating.
Okay, so the green bar is getting bigger because they're taking over more stuff. The brown bar is getting smaller because the Army's pulling out.
Yes.
So this allows people to visually see the transition that's happening, not from black to white, but a gradual turnover and expansion.
And you can see the big branching part on the right was added, not because they knew precisely what was going to happen in that part of the planning, but what they knew is that would be the point if somebody came into one of these public meetings and said, I want this or that building. That was when they would be making those discussions and entertaining those proposals. So after they got oriented, they would go to the next thing that we would ask them to do, which is we had maps on all these tables of the Presidio, and here's a map.
Now, I can see as a member of the public that this picture is much more accessible than the previous one. While the murals, it's huge, and you're thinking city planners and landscape architects, but what does this mean to me, a mom who wants to take her child for walks? And what if I've got 3 dogs, and is there somewhere I can go? So I guess this is how you help people understand?
Well, we had a picture, in addition to the large process map, we also had a picture that showed the Presidio like this, and around it we listed all the issues that people are concerned about: dog walking, sailboarding, would the MPs, or would the park police be able to keep, people from just camping there, et cetera.
Oh, that's right, the homeless people.
But
did they still have a place to stay?
And the picture did engage people. Then we asked people, and I'm going to draw here, we had on the map of the Presidio circles, and we had squares, and the circles and the squares represented values and uses. And so if you can imagine the circles and squares, we asked then people sitting around this chart to actually tell us what they valued and wanted to preserve in the blue circles, what uses they wanted, and then along the bottom we allowed them to write in additional issues. So this went on for an hour, and then we asked those small groups to tell us, and on a mural as big as that first one, we recorded all of their ideas. So it was actually a very theatrical experience of being listened to.
Yes.
This is like a whole community being listened to. Well, Don Newbacher, the person who was the head of Yosemite, was experienced this. And he got very excited about it.
Yeah. And what happened? So he saw it work in the Presidio. And what was the challenge that Yosemite was facing that he thought he needed to go through this kind of big
this
process?
was not exactly the beginning of this. I mean, the idea of using very large murals started earlier. And I think you were very interested when we were talking about that this isn't just applied to government.
Yes. However, we're really wanting to focus on the government until a little bit later in the program, so that we'll switch to the private companies. So let's talk some more about how Yosemite and the Presidio worked. How I remember that when we talked earlier, the whole idea of using big pictures in the Presidio process came out of some landscape architect's approach to community involvement.
Yes.
I think somebody called Larry Halperin.
Yes, he was one of the first people who inspired me. He had a process called take-part workshopping, where he would get people involved, like the city of Pomona, when he did a vision for them.
Pomona, California.
Yeah, and he would choreograph people going out into the community and experiencing it, and coming back to a gymnasium where he had large blueprints, somewhat like this picture of the Presidio.
Yes.
Only this was the downtown Pomona.
Yeah.
And collage materials, markers, glitter, other things, and would have the community groups actually do a construct, kind of a montage of their idea of the future of Pomona.
Yes.
Then overnight, his young apprentices and architects would turn these into concepts. So they would come back the next day and they would see 7 or 8 urban planning concepts coming right out of the community thinking.
Yep.
So this take-part workshopping was very influential when we were developing facilitation like this in the 70s.
Yes.
I began working this way a lot with the Coro Center for Civic Leadership, where I was a staff member.
Yep.
And businesses began getting interested, and I actually was then invited to start working in this graphic way in lots of different companies.
Yes, yes. So it kind of started where you were taking pictures from the landscape architect way of doing things involving people. And then you started to see that this could be applied in businesses and in the community. It seems like the Presidio was a very large project and many people involved. And yet the point of it actually wasn't that picture, right? It was about
the dialogue. It was about
talking,
the exchange of people. Yeah.
Feeling heard, being in a place where they felt people wanted to hear what they were talking about, what their values, what uses they could imagine, and a place where they had a chance to express the issues of concern. Do you feel that through this process, the public servants, the municipalities, the national service staff, in fact, were able to hear these things, and did pictures help?
Yeah, well, all of the planning staff for the Presidio went to all these meetings. And so they got to actually hear the public in all these different iterations. Yeah. We then went even farther. We had one of the biggest events planning events that I've been a part of out on one of the piers at Fort Mason.
Yeah.
And in one weekend, we installed, halfway through the planning process, something like a dozen different graphic booths showing all the different aspects of the planning. And we created a mural factory and created cross-sections of the Presidio. We looked at how the buildings, the residential buildings, would be rehabbed. We looked at all kinds of challenges of recreational use, et cetera. And about 250 people or more from the community came, and we had interactive ways of gathering their information. So this visual way of working actually has been pretty highly developed as a way of doing community visioning and community processes.
How do you think that this interacting with the pictures helps to further the dialogue so that people can express things that perhaps they wouldn't have expressed before? How does that happen? Why do pictures pull us out of ourselves in that kind of way?
Well, part of what has really worked is getting a group of people who've got a vision or a strategy to think about picturing it and then asking them, all right, what would be the appropriate graphic way to do it?
Yeah.
Now, what that does is it invites people to start thinking about how they organize complex ideas in their mind. So we got started with the very big processes at National Semiconductor. When they were almost bankrupt in 1990, they had bought Fairchild Semiconductor and were really struggling to make sense out of it. And they brought in Gil Amelio, who was a physicist who had 21 patents and really had an idea. He turned around a prior semiconductor company. And he had a vision and wanted to present it to his people, but it was a technical vision. It was like a classic turnaround. And the people who were asked to support it wanted to actually bring this to life in the way that you were talking about.
Wow. So now I was in Intel, and we were not using pictures. Maybe you want to help us go and show us how this happened. But let me just say a few words. At Intel is one of the leading companies in the Valley. National Semiconductor was a big competitor, and we were using PowerPoints and text, and so it blows my mind that National Semiconductor would have gone all the way out to think about using these pictures in crazy San Francisco style. How did they bring you into straight blue collar? I mean, really, it was like people are pretty straight in the semiconductor companies.
Well, the vision that Gil Amelio was putting forth actually was a very persuasive vision. It was basically to take a company that had 4,000 different products, but no central processing unit, and actually go upscale by rationalizing the portfolio and working on some very distinct parts of the whole area that was needed for computing, like input, output, energy management, that kind of thing. So,
but David, if it was so straightforward, why did he need pictures?
Well, he wasn't sure that he needed pictures, but his change team did. So they had gone to a workshop on doing this visual way of working, and they asked me to create this picture, the result of what you're seeing here. But it started as a small picture that I shared with the change team, and the main consultant with National, Bob Miles, who was a Harvard Business School guy who'd come out and was working with Gil Amelio, he looked at this 8-foot-long picture and he said, look, it's got to be twice as long, and it's got to have all these question marks in the middle. And it was the time of re-engineering. A lot of people were re-engineering. So what we did on this large mural that you now see was we put the current state picture on the left and the vision on the right. However, to the point about the imagery, I saw that when I was looking at the vision, that what Gil really was saying is we want to take kind of a space barge and turn it into the Enterprise.
A space barge?
Well, a spaceship that was a space barge. So let me come back over here and show you this.
So let me recap. There was this original vision where Gil Amelio is saying, we want to become the spaceship Enterprise, and then we was just starting with a space barge, and the big question was, how do we get from here to there?
Yeah.
And your challenge was really to help people build that picture together about how to transform the barge into the Enterprise.
Exactly.
Okay, tell us.
And they argued about whether or not, and I've got this picture here on my computer again, if you can look at it, the picture on the left is the unassembled spaceship with its fuel rods and everything there, and it hasn't taken off.
Can we zoom in? I'd like to see what's going on there.
Yeah, we can zoom in.
I always wanted to know what a space barge looked like.
Well, it's not actually assembled. You don't have, for instance, the rockets of commitment and empowerment. We actually had people argue about how much the core competencies, these fuel rods, were in. So that's actually a little graph of what they had. The values of the windows that are on the ground. The organization is on top, and all the marketing messages are along there. But after a year of input at these leading change meetings, look what they ended up doing. The spaceship took off.
Okay.
It took off, and now the projects that were supporting it were more defined. The central part was more defined. The vision on the right changed in a couple of key instances. This went through 4 years of iterations, and at the end of this time, they had 95% vision recognition worldwide. It was the first time their assembly plant people in Malacca and Indonesia ever really understood what they were doing. And the folks in Scotland and other places really liked it as well.
Now, this is Gil Amelio's on-ramp, where he was recognized as a turnaround artist. He took National Semiconductor from near bankruptcy to one of the most admired companies, and he used it as a launch pad to actually get to Apple Computer right after that, I think. So
that is another whole story, which we won't go into.
No. Can we zoom into what happened? I want to follow through. You know, it's not about the pictures in the end. It's about what people do after this. How did...
Well,
okay, Malacca, they knew
it's not about
this.
The pictures. Yeah. It's about co-creating understanding. So one of the things that happened with this mural is that all of the divisions of the company went through a very considered process of how they could adjust themselves to actually fulfill this vision. Yeah. And they then created their own pictures for their divisions. We did 16 of these across the company.
Okay.
And we got people inside the company creating them. So some of the Asian artists were electric in the way that they improvised once they saw the template for this kind of story. If you look at it abstractly, the vision's on the right, the current state and the history is on the left, the challenges are in the middle. They copied that same format, but they used their images.
So you're saying that pictures can be a global language.
Absolutely.
That can cut through some of the cultural barriers. So, you know, I was born in Singapore, and I had to do a big culture shock thing when I came over to the U.S. And even now, going back and forth, talking to the business people in the U.S. and then going back and talking in Singapore, it's a different language. In fact, I may even use a different part of my brain. But what you're saying is a very interesting thing, that visual language can help people go beyond those cultural barriers. And as somebody of an Asian ancestry, I know the pictorial format of Chinese characters make us much more attuned to the context and the overall picture. So what are you going to do now?
Well, I want to show you. I will. In Japan, we have a a template called a graphic game plan, which basically shows an arrow going to a target over some barriers over a series of stages. So basically, if you look at a team of people, the team itself, and the target, and the tasks, you get a pretty good action plan. This is called the graphic game plan. When I went to Japan, the Japanese people are much more in touch with natural metaphors.
Yes.
And I tried something. I said, what if we did this inside of a natural metaphor where we have the ground, we've got the project, we've got root competencies, we've got the benefits that we want out of the project.
Apples.
We've got pests that attack it here and gardeners that support it here, and it's going to go through some stages of growth. Now, it's the very same template.
Yes.
But it's embedded in a natural metaphor.
Yeah.
And they had no problem doing this. They sent them into small groups. They did it all in Japanese. They reported it back in Japanese. I had a translator who was going through it. But they completely understood this as a formative metaphor. So pictures actually are the lens into systems thinking for most people.
Yes. Now, you have your own visual language. I notice you using different elements, people, arrows, apples. Have you developed a kind of vocabulary for this? Or do you make it up each time?
Oh, no. There's a very systematic thing, and studied the archetypes a lot. So, for instance, circles pretty much universally mean something that's unified. So that's a pretty good symbol for a meeting. Oh. And something that is box-like suggests something that's organized. So you have buildings, in spreadsheets, but when you add a box to an arrow, it's an organized project because arrows move. But if you take that same arrow and make it wavy, it actually looks more like forces, like environmental forces that are working on something. So symbols like this actually have embedded meaning.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes from the experience of actually drawing the symbol.
And how quickly do people pick this up?
We've been teaching people all over the world how to do this. It's now actually a whole profession. And people, it's like playing the piano or any performance art. It's something anybody can do, and if they choose to do it, that they can learn how to do these simple drawings.
Yeah. So let's take a look at what you're doing here. You've got the symbols underneath, but above that you've got a landscape. Now I see like a sun and a mountain. Mm-hmm. So what do these symbols bring to mind for people?
Well, this was going to be a backdrop of the process of why these murals work. So if this is a landscape, most people who are trying to make change, here's a building here, need to go through some kind of a process to get to the changing situation. So the question that managers face is, how do you keep people held in that there's some kind of order while you're going through all this change? Because you're going to, basically disrupt things.
Yes.
And so what you end up doing is you plan a series of meetings, small groups and big groups, over a period of time. And in that process, you're doing versions of these pictures. So you're doing version 1, version 2, version 3. Meanwhile, all kinds of people are feeding in. But this process holds people into a feeling that it's organized and moving forward. So that's exactly what we did with Yosemite.
Okay, let's go back to the Yosemite picture, and we started with it. So now we've learned some of the language and the symbols and the techniques that were used. Tell us what happened. How did Yosemite use pictures to pull people together to help set priorities in the planning of this precious natural resource that belongs to the whole world? People come from all over to see it, and they all have their opinions about what should happen.
Yes.
So, but we only have a couple of minutes, so let's get into this.
This was a result of several meetings with the top management and Don Neubacher, as well as all of his branch chiefs. And what they did is they basically zoomed in and they said, here is the resource. Now, you'll notice on the left is El Capitan, on the right is Old Grizzly, the large sequoia, and in the middle is the valley. Well, to give you an idea of what they argued about with images, this is just one of the wonderful discussions we had. In the center, of course, is their mission and the principles that they work by, but also these sacred images here. You'll notice Half Dome, Yosemite Falls, a little frog that's endangered, and here you have a sweat lodge from the native people. Well, in the original drawing, I had the Ahwahnee in the middle, which is their also treasured thing.
The big hotel there.
And I had the sweat lodge just outside. The branch chief said, no, the sweat lodge needs to go in the middle of the circle.
Yes.
And the Ahwahnee outside. Now, it's not that it's less important. It's just that what is very important right now is their relationships with the native communities in that valley, as well as the endangered species. So every single graphic here matches the words that are up in the sky and allowed them to think both rationally and heartfully.
Yes.
So in some ways what this does is it blends the planning activity with the culture that needs to implement it.
I think there's something about pictures that speaks to our hearts.
Absolutely.
And so when something as close to our hearts as Yosemite National Park has to do planning, then using pictures allows us to bring all our hopes and dreams together so that Yosemite can be what it can be for the country and for future generations.
They went on and had all the branch chiefs do graphic game plans of all of those emphasis areas, so they could carry it on internally.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you, David. This is a great introduction, and I hope we'll do this again.
Thank you.
Okay.